Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Anna Zayaruznaya, who is assistant professor in the Department of Music at Yale University. Her research brings the history of musical forms and notation into dialogue with medieval literature, iconography, and the history of ideas. Her work has appeared in the leading journals of her field. Today we'll talk with Professor Zayaruznaya about her book, The Monstrous New Art, Divided Forms in the Late Medieval Motet, for which she was awarded the MacMillan Center's Gaddis Smith International Book Prize. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you, Marilyn. It's great to be here.
Let's begin with an overview of your book. Please tell us about it.
Well, it's a book about the motet, and the motet it's a genre of song. It's actually the longest lived musical genre, probably. The earliest motets are from the 13th century. Bach was writing motets, and composers today are still writing motets. But for me, when I think about the motet in the early 14th century, what I mean by that is a shortish song for 3 or 4 voices that has words.
Okay.
Which is not very specific, but it's the words that are key here. So earlier today, my students, my doctoral students, Will Watson and Pippa Ovenden got together with me, and we actually recorded a motet that we'll play now, so you can see a little more what I'm talking about.
Okay, great. Let's take a look.
So what you might hear there is that each of us is singing a different set of words.
Oh, okay.
And so there's a lot of words going on. And so the name of the genre motet comes actually from the French word for mot, for word, which is mot.
Okay.
So my big research question for this book is, how do the musical structures of motets relate to the words that are in them?
Okay.
That is, given this emphasis on words in the genre, what are the musical sort of consequences of whatever a given motet might be about? And especially the question is sort of sharpened by the fact that motets at this time are about some pretty strange things. Like when we think about what songs are about today, maybe they're about love, or
right.
Maybe they're political songs. But this motet is about this sort of horse, or like a half horse, half man, evil creature named Lavelle, whose name stands for a bunch of vices: flattery, avarice, villainy, changefulness, that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. And he represents everything that's wrong with the world. And there's a book written about him in 1310, 1314, and then a manuscript made of this book with lots of music in it, including this motet. And so they're singing, the actual lowest voice is in the mouth of this kind of evil horse that is corrupting Christendom, and it's corrupting France, and the form of the piece is also in a certain kind of approximate way actually giving us a sense of the form of this evil horse monster thing. And so a long time ago I started wondering, why do they write the motets about the things they write motets about? Mm-hmm. And given this emphasis on words and also an emphasis on the newest sort of musical developments in musical notation, in music structure, how do words and music relate here?
Mm-hmm. So this motet that we just saw is in French. Are they often in French, or are there other languages?
In the repertory I study, they're either in French or in Latin, or sometimes both at the same time. So one of the voices might be in French and one might be in Latin.
Okay, so you mentioned the lower voice was of the monster. What are the other 2 voices?
In this case, they're of the people who are living in this world that he is corrupting, and they're doleful and they're sad because everything is wrong, everything is bad. I mean, it's an interesting story. For a lot of reasons, it feels very, very contemporary. They're complaining that everything is turned upside down and the good people are being punished and the bad people are being rewarded, and they just don't know which way to turn or what to do with themselves. So it's a social critique.
I was going to say, it sounds very political to me.
It is very political.
Okay.
Yeah, and so that's one of the functions. So starting from pieces like this, I got into, I found other motets from this time that were about monsters or the monstrous or hybrid creatures that were part something and part something else. And it turns out that one of the functions of the monster and the monstrous in medieval thought is to do criticism. It's a way to do criticism sort of viscerally, just kind of like if you think of caricature and the way that caricature brings out certain features to make people less human and more more sort of menacing or funny or whatever, that the monstrous is used to highlight kind of everything that's wrong with the world and to put it into sharp relief. Okay,
a couple things come to mind. I want to know, you look at specific composers, but in your talking about the kind of the political color of the motet, I'm wondering if people wrote them with imagery because they perhaps were afraid of coming out and speaking in their own voice. So using a monster, the image of a monster, to really convey what they're feeling themselves without perhaps being persecuted? I mean, is that a possibility at all?
I think so. If you criticize one person, then you're only criticizing one person. But if you criticize an allegory of the filthiest, worst, most corrupt possible creature, then everybody in their own mind goes to a particular place. And so I think that criticism that's done in allegorical terms ends up being more powerful because it lashes out in multiple directions at once, and ultimately has more staying power because here we are. And so the story of Lavelle feels very, very fresh right now. Lavelle he's a yellow-haired horse, and he's just a horse, but people they raise him up to be a leader, and they're petting him and they're loving him, and he gets more kind of puffed up on their praise and decides that he's going to take over France. And so, and then a lot of the manuscript is basically using this story to point at everything that's actually wrong and saying the clergy are corrupt and the rulers don't care and the rich just want to be richer at the expense of the poor and all this stuff. And because it's a story about a horse in this fictional land that happens to also be Paris in the 1310s, but because it's a story, I think it actually has more staying power than if it were just straight up,
Right. And what a universal theme too, really, which
it really is
interesting.
It is. It's in some ways comforting to see that somebody in the 13 teens thought the world is really almost ending. I mean, it couldn't be worse. It must be almost the apocalypse because creatures that are so unsuited to be rulers are being put in the highest positions of government, and we are really, the Antichrist must be at hand. And on the one hand, it's comforting to know that it didn't end then, and hopefully it's not going to end now. On the other hand, you think, God, haven't we been here before so many times?
Exactly, yeah. So I'm interested to know how you became interested in this. What led you to write the book?
So actually, Lavelle, this weird horse, kind of was the beginning of it. Because actually, even when I was an undergrad, I was a junior, and I was at Wesleyan, but I was studying abroad in Oxford. And in Oxford, you have, instead of classes, you have tutors, and you sort of go through things a little bit more at your own pace. And a particular tutor gave me a call number for this book to take out when I gave it to the librarian. And they gave me this giant book. I mean, it's probably this big, and it's a facsimile, a photocopy of this manuscript that lives in Paris. And it was all about this, the disastrous rise of this evil horse. And it was a hugely lavish manuscript, beautifully decorated pages. And I thought, who are these people? Like, why are you putting so much creative energy and musical creativity and interest into telling the story of this monstrous horse. And so that then led me to start thinking about these motets and thinking about the ways they use the monstrous, and eventually that kind of led to this book.
Okay, let's talk about the composers that you use in the book and kind of about your methodology.
So the book is not composer-centered. In fact, when I started writing my dissertation, I decided I wasn't going to really think about composers at all, partly because most of this music survives anonymously in the manuscripts. So they just weren't in the habit of attributing pieces or putting composers' names in the margins in the way that you start to see by the end of the 15th century. But several composers do keep coming up as I continued my research. There was two especially. One, Guillaume de Machaut, and we know what he wrote because he collected big collected works, manuscripts of all his stuff. So we actually know exactly what he wrote. And he is interested in the goddess Fortuna, who is a kind of monster because she's split down the center, and half of her is like old and scowling and miserable, and half of her is beautiful and young. And so she's a kind of a vertically split monster, and Machaut writes a lot about her. But the other composer that writes about a bigger variety of deformed creatures and writes about them a variety of what you might say deformed motets, so he's using musical form in a particular way, is somebody named Philippe de Vitry, and he's actually the subject of my next book.
Okay. So how did you find all of these motets? I mean, how many are there? Could you quantify them? I mean, are there thousands or really not that many?
Not that many, I guess. In the 14th century, if you're thinking about French motets that are kind of related and in this idiom, and they share sources and they share composers, it's maybe 90 or 100 pieces. And of them, in this book, I probably deal seriously with 10 or 15. So it's a small subset of the repertory, but they're very rich, partly because you have 2 or 3 texts per piece. And then the bottom voice often is actually taken from Gregorian chant, from plain chant.
Oh, interesting.
So that gives you then another context in which to think, okay, well, this isn't just a piece of music, it's a piece of music that comes from somewhere. So what knowledge does it bring with it into the piece? And the same for the upper voices. They may have quotations in them from songs, from classical literature. There's a lot of Ovidian quotation and allusion. So they are very dense texts and very dense musical objects, so there's a lot to do with them.
So I imagine you've translated the ones that you're using in your book into English?
Yes, there's a lot of translation involved, and there's also a sort of musical translation. The motets survive in notation that is in a lot of ways like ours. Like you would look at them and you'd say, okay, that's musical notation. But then the details of it get a little bit fuzzy, so you have to learn how to read the older notation, and then think about translating it into a modern notation that your readers can follow. So there's both. There's editing and translation of texts from both French and Latin into English, and then also translating of older music notations into newer music notations.
And then I imagine when the reader is reading your book, they must have to imagine how the song sounds, or do you provide a way for them to hear the music as well?
So it was really important for me to provide a way for my readers to hear the music, partly because I wanted this book to be not just for musicologists, and certainly not just for musicologists who think about music of the 14th century, but I wanted it to be comprehensible to the kinds of readers whom I'm reading and doing my research: art historians, historians of intellectual culture, historians of various medieval sort of types. And so I think all of the music examples are recorded, and they are online, and then can be listened to. And that was through a various grants that I received to do that. And it's been generally well received, I think, and I'm really glad they're there, because we want to, since interdisciplinary work is so important right now, not only should we be reading in different disciplines, but it seems important to write then work that is accessible to those same broad disciplines, hopefully without sacrificing the specificity of the kinds of analysis that I like to do.
I am interested to know, during the time period where these motets were being sung, did they have special singers sing them, or was it, where people would go? Was it a performance, or did people sing these in their day-to-day lives, kind of thing?
It's a great question, and it's really hard to know exactly because we don't have the kinds of rich accounts that we would like to have. We have offhand comments, like somebody saying, "Well, one time I was at a what did he call it? A small gathering of discerning people." So essentially a cocktail party, right? And motets were performed. So I think my best guess, and the best guess of people in my field, is that these were sung as entertainment by clerics, so sort of the educated, the nerd class, like the secretaries of kings and of bishops, and they themselves were clerics, but maybe not, at least often not deeply in the church. They weren't necessarily cloistered. They were sort of secular clerics.
So that's interesting. So was it exclusively men who were singing these motets?
We know that women sang in the 14th century. They probably sang motets. It's again, it's hard to know, but there's enough evidence of women singers, and some of them probably quite talented, and certainly courtly songs. So motets they're kind of funny. They're not courtly. They're not really about love as much. They can be. And they're also not exactly religious, though they can be. They occupy this strange category where they can be about just really many different things. And that also makes it hard to place them in a cultural context because they're so different from each other.
Okay, yeah, I actually was going to ask, were you able to, in reading the lyrics, correlate any of those lyrics to what was going on politically or culturally or socially during that time period?
Absolutely. So some motets are in praise of specific rulers, whether they be popes or kings, and so then that's easy to say. Okay, well then maybe this was for the occasion of this pope's ordination, or for this king's for a particular celebration or something. Though even then, it's often hard to pinpoint exactly which one. 700 years later, but sometimes they are in honor of saints, and then the saints will have been dead for hundreds of years or more, and then you have to ask yourself, to whom is this saint important now and why? And it ultimately, tends to be political in that way. And then, the more, some motets are just really, especially Vitri's motets, tend to just be social critique, a critique against the groveling courtier. So the person at court who just has no independence, they just toe the line, and wouldn't you rather be your own person? Wouldn't you rather think your own thoughts, even if it meant having less money and less prestige? And that kind of a piece, because of its universality, is absolutely impossible to place historically.
Yeah.
It
But
could be from any time.
It's fascinating, though, that people were having those thoughts, so far back. So it is amazing, really. So your book kind of brings a new perspective to medieval and Renaissance music. So why don't you talk a little bit about how your work is a little bit different and a different approach from what is out there in terms of scholarly publications?
Well, my work builds on a lot of other work, and so it's certainly standing on the shoulders of giants, for sure. I think the thing that the sort of broadest questions I raise are questions about what song is and how we can think of it. And so one of the things I do is suggest that instead of thinking of motets and other medieval songs as these sort of monumental floating things, the way we think of a Beethoven symphony, Lydia Gurr, who's a philosopher, has talked about the work concept, that there's a museum of musical works somewhere in our minds, and that's where Beethoven's symphonies live. And whereas these motets, they seemed to change with the times. They were updated. They were actually going for a kind of immediate relevance, and they were much more concerned with what was going on right then. They weren't trying to be immortal, but they also were not completely ephemeral. They had a sort of cultural staying power. So I offer a creature concept of the medieval work in my book that's sort of trying to say, well, here are motets that kind of embody the monsters that they're about, and what does that tell us? What does it give us if we think about a piece of music as a creature as opposed to as something that is like a building, right? And the other thing I do is I think broadly about the relationship between words and music. And so we have words to describe how music and words relate in later repertories, like in 16th century madrigals, so Italian songs from the 16th century. We often talk about text painting, which is when you get a word like up or skies and you go up, the musical line goes up, or you sing about the abyss and you go down. And that's a very local relationship between word and tone. And that doesn't happen very much in medieval music. And so if you then look at medieval music and ask whether it does the kinds of things that later music does to relate word and tone, you see that it doesn't. It doesn't do that because they're later things. And so my question was, well, what does it do? And so I posit a broader relation between word and tone that's not on the level of the individual note in the word, but actually on the level of the piece of music and its broader message. Mm-hmm. And then I think about the ways in which medieval intellectual traditions, like analogy, support that kind of relation.
Mm-hmm. So ultimately, what would you like the reader to take away from your book?
I would like them to know that the people who wrote these motets did so very carefully, did so very playfully, but also very seriously, that they were thinking about the biggest issues of their day, and also the biggest musical issues of their day, the new possibilities made available by developments in notation, new formal possibilities, and they were constructing works of art that put these things into this created encounters, I guess, between important things in life and important things in music. And so it's worth our time looking at these with the kinds of detail and the kinds of care that really carefully constructed works of art command.
Thank you so much for being here with us today. This has been fascinating.
Thank you for having me.
For more information about Professor Zayaruznaya and her work, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.